Hey everyone, welcome in to pre-comp review video number 2, where tonight's focus for U.S. history is going to be on the saga of Native Americans. There's a lot where we can go into this topic, and ultimately tomorrow we're going to look at Andrew Jackson's Indian removal policy in the context of his presidency that really is a sour note in the long history of Native Americans losing territory as a result of white encroachment. And by white encroachment, of course, that goes all the way back to the very beginning when Europeans first arrived in the Americas. I want to focus things exclusively, though, from the Native American perspective. And for the review video tonight, the idea is going to be on looking at how natives responded to European encroachment. And encroachment, just by the way, just means moving onto somebody else's territory. Going back to the very first and in the beginning of the arrival, the Europeans and natives, instantly were in conflict. And in the modern-day United States region, the conflict stemmed from trade. The Europeans viewed the natives as potential trade allies and people who could be used to gain resources, especially if you remember from the beginning of the year, fur. The natives provided fur, and the fur trade was one of the main ways that Europeans interacted with natives. But from the native perspective, engaging in trade was often treacherous. The Europeans took advantage of natives, and natives often lost land as a result of the Europeans wanting to gain more rights to trade in their territories. From the native perspective, one of the most important consequences is the fact that natives were forced to choose sides. Native groups that were long in competition with one another for the fur trade now had to choose sides not only against other natives, but also with the Europeans. And that led to the development of what we studied early on in American history of proxy wars. Natives were dragged into conflicts with European countries as a result of natives having the keys to the fur trade. And the Beaver Wars is one of those conflicts, those proxy wars we talked about, where the Iroquois and the Algonquin, two rival tribes in the Northeast, fought with the European powers. The Iroquois allied with the English and the Algonquin allied with the French. And when the Iroquois won the war and buried the Algonquin, that meant the English gained fur trade access in the Northeast. So the proxy wars that were a result of Europeans trying to gain trade rights dragged Native Americans into these conflicts. Another theme that we discussed, though, about natives was fighting for survival. Natives were often forced to make choices. Do we fight the Europeans or do we try to, coexist peacefully? We studied how in the Pilgrims case in Massachusetts, in Plymouth, the natives helped the Europeans survive. And without their help, there would have never been maybe a successful Plymouth colony. But as more and more Europeans began to arrive in the New World, especially in Massachusetts, that put the Native Americans in direct conflict with the Europeans. And this question of, do we fight or do we just sort of get along peacefully? There were two wars we studied. The Pequot War, which was in the 1640s, and then, of course, the big one, King Philip's War in the 1670s. Those two wars were fought for control of New England between the English and the natives. The English won both wars commandingly. They crushed the natives in the Pequot War, and then they crushed King Philip's armies in the King Philip's War, or Metacom's War, if you want to go by his Native American name. Natives often, when they fought Europeans, lost. And this was a common theme, not just in terms of the English, but with the French, with the Dutch, and even the Spanish, who conquered most of the American Southwest. There are very few instances where we can look back and say that Native Americans were successful. There was one instance in colonial history, the Pueblo Uprising in modern-day New Mexico, where Native Americans fended off the Spanish, but only to have the Spanish eventually reconquer that territory. So the Pueblo Uprising, or as it's sometimes called Pope's Rebellion, was one instance where natives successfully defeated the Europeans. As we move forward into the 1700s, the proxy wars would continue, and the ultimate proxy war that was the French and Indian War, where natives chose sides again with the Europeans. And as the English won that war, remember, they took very little care for the Native Americans, and Native Americans continued to lose land. But there was an instance at the end of the French and Indian War where natives fought back, and they rebelled against the English in what was known as Pontiac's Rebellion, where natives banded together to fight off again, as they had done before, the European encroachment. Ultimately, though, like King Philip's War before it, Pontiac's Rebellion was a failure. It did not succeed, and the Native Americans were again forced on the defense. Ultimately, another proxy war was the American Revolution, where natives often sided with the British in hopes that after the Americans were defeated, the British would restore native lands. But that didn't happen. When the British lost the war, the natives were totally left out of the Treaty of Paris, totally left to fend for themselves, and as a result, the Native Americans lost more and more land to the Americans now, the United States. And the United States government did not take into account native claims to land. And ultimately, there's going to be another example of a native uprising against now the Americans. And that was the one we studied more recently with the Battle of Tippecanoe, and that was Tecumseh's War. So just to go over all the different wars again, the big proxy wars we've talked about were the Beaver Wars, the French and Indian War, and the American Revolution War. That's where natives got dragged into European conflicts. The direct conflicts that we studied where natives tried to fight off Europeans but lost, we have the Pequot War, we've got Popay's Rebellion, Metacom's War, aka King Philip's War, and then we have in the 1700s Pontiac's Rebellion, Tecumseh's War. And now we'll be getting into, in class tomorrow, talking about how Native Americans were again going to become in direct conflict with the American government. And this is going to take place predominantly in the American Southeast. For years, Native tribes in Florida had fought against the American government in what were known as the Seminole Wars. The Seminole Wars. And the Seminole Wars were named in honor of a native tribe in the South, the Seminoles, and the Seminoles fought against the American government. In fact, Andrew Jackson, before he became president, fought in these wars. And this is another example of the natives fighting against Europeans but ultimately losing. But tomorrow we'll be getting into how natives were ultimately pushed off their land forcibly. They were moved out into modern-day Oklahoma. It's a brutal story. It doesn't really have a happy ending, and it just fits the narrative of more and more natives being subjugated to death and destruction in American history, unfortunately. So there's a lot I categorized here, and again, the general theme is that natives often, there's no happy ending. And I got news for you. There isn't going to be a happy ending moving forward. There just is no happy ending as we continue along here in U.S. history. So I'll leave you guys with that. Tomorrow, again, gear up for the end of Jackson and the Native American policies that he brought forward. And then we'll kind of shift gears and get into some other topics that we'll be reviewing and covering before the pre-comp. So I wish you guys a good rest of your Tuesday evening. The past shapes the future. Take care.